Shalom Aleichem. Welcome back to the Clinical Halacha series, where we discover and discuss significant and relevant medical shailas through the lens of the Musaira and the Gedolei HaAchronim. Today we're going to discuss the sugya, the discussion, and the concept of medical testing vis-a-vis animals in Halacha. Now, animals have been repeatedly used in medical history for biomedical research. It actually goes back to Aristotle in 384 to 322 BC, who did extensive testing on animals and medications and procedures. Galen, a bit later, in 129 to 199 AD, who was a Greek physician who lived in Rome, and he was considered a giant in the history of medicine. He conducted extensive animal experiments for anatomy, physiology, pathology, and pharmacology. Going forward approximately 1800 years, Claude Bernard, who is known as the modern father of physiology, stated, and I quote, "Experiments on animals are entirely conclusive for the toxicology and hygiene of man. The effects of these substances are the same on man as on animals, save for differences in degree." And he actually established animal experimentation as part of the standard scientific method. Now we know that the difference of degree is not the only differentiation, and there is significant pathology, pharmacokinetics, physiological differences between animals and humans, but on a certain aspect, Bernard was correct, that many of the experiments on animals are conclusive for toxicology and the hygiene of man. Now, in America, it's interesting that drug testing actually became mandated in 1938 by the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which was the modern precursor of the FDA. And the story goes that in 1937, there was a large pharmaceutical company in the United States, and they created a preparation of a sulfa drug. And they mixed into the sulfa drug diethylene glycol, which is really an industrial solvent, and they marketed it as an elixir of sulfa. Now, diethylene glycol is actually poisonous to humans, but the company's pharmaceutical chief just added some raspberry flavoring and figured that everybody would be okay. Unfortunately, there was a mass poisoning, and the deaths of more than 100 people occurred, which was the impetus for the creation of the FDA, and one of the requirements was the mandation of testing on animals prior to the marketing of human drugs. A similar example is, as is well known, is the fiasco, unfortunately, tragic fiasco of thalidomide, which we know in the 50s and 60s was used primarily for morning sickness in pregnant women. It was never tested on animals prior, and certainly not on pregnant animals. And unfortunately, the numbers state that approximately 10,000 children in more than 46 countries were born with malformations or missing limbs, phocomelia, and is obviously withdrawn after a long campaign. So certainly the benefits of animal testing are undeniable, and we've seen many cases, unfortunately, where testing did not take place, and unfortunately there were tragic side effects. If we look at the modern invention of many of our drugs, almost all of them did in fact predate with animal testing before they were introduced into the human market. We know that penicillin was really discovered by Fleming in 1928. He published it actually in the British Medical Journal. It really was set aside, it was an afterthought, till approximately 12 years later, where in Oxford University, Florey carried out certain experiments that penicillin could protect mice against infections, specifically streptococcus, and really then on, it was the kind of introduction of real penicillin. I think the first test case was a British policeman, Albert Alexander, who had abscesses, etc., and they used it and it was remarkably effective. So penicillin, which is the basis of modern antibiotics, began on mice testing. Of course, we know a bit earlier, Banting and Best's pioneering work of insulin in the 1920s was involving dogs where they removed the pancreas and they tested insulin in to see the efficacy on these animals. So penicillin, insulin, and to bring it a little bit today's modern society of GLP-1s, all the glutides. So that actually was discovered from a Gila monster, saliva, and we did extensive testing in rodents and primate studies to go into and analyze the efficacy where it came from. And really that is the way it is for most of our drugs, insulin, penicillin, GLP-1s. We did extensive testing to discover their efficacy, the dosaging, the toxicity, the pharmacokinetics, the biochemistry of how these drugs were metabolized, how they were efficacious, and the dosaging, etc. So that is all the medical component. The question is, how does Halacha view all these practices? Does Halacha condone? Does Halacha allow with limitations? Does Halacha entirely forbid? Let's look at the sugya through the lens of the Mefarshim, through the Gedolei HaChroidim, through the Balei Mesaira, through the Gedolei HaPeskim of the previous years, to analyze this sugya. So the Iker Nekuda to begin with is, of course, the Isser of Tsa'ar Balei Chayim. We know there's an Isser to not cause harm or pain to animals. And according to most Rishonim, this Isser is actually an Isser de Araisa. It is forbidden on a biblical level, on a Torah level, to cause pain to animals. The Rambam says in Mar Nevuchim Gimel Yud Zayin, the Sefer Chasidim in Tafrei Shamech Vav, and many other Rishonim. The lashon of the Rambam is Umnam Omram Tsar Balechaim de Araisa. No Shaila. There's a small side note that the Gra in Shulchan Aruch Reish Ayin Beis says maybe the Rambam from Yad HaChazaka is mashma. It's not de Araisa, but the consensus of the vast majority of Paiskim, Rishonim, Achronim, is that Tsar Balechaim is de Araisa. So you have Tsar Balechaim D'Oraisa, but we have the need, maybe a compelling human interest, maybe Pikuach Nefesh, to do animal testing. So what is the halacha? So there's a Ramah. The Ramah in Even Ezer Heyadalad says that anything that you need to do for medicinal purposes or for any other purpose, as long as there is a validated purpose, says the Ramah, Leis Bein Mishum Isser Tsar Balechayim. There's no Isser Tsar Balechayim. He says even you could even pluck the feathers out of a live chicken if you need to use the feathers, but he says that one should refrain from doing because it is unnecessary wickedness. Fine. So presumably the Fida Ramah, because any medicinal purpose is mutter, and we don't care, we obviate, there is no Isser of Tsar Balei Chayim. So it's pashit. If one would want to do animal testing, he is doing it for a medicinal purpose. L'chayra, it should be entirely mutter. But if you look at the Chuvas Imrei Shefer in Siman Lamed Daled, he says that which the Ramah allows us to cause pain to animals for medicinal purposes is if right now, for example, I would need something from an animal to heal a chayla that's right in front of me. So then I can cause pain to the animal to heal a human being that's in front of me. But if there's only a theoretical purpose, a theoretical gain, a potential medicinal benefit, says the Imrei Shefer, there's not going to be any heter, and that's not what the Ramah is speaking about. And ipso facto, it would come out if you would do that, you are causing unnecessary pain to the animal, and therefore you would transgress, you'd be over Tsar Balei Chayim. So the Fida Imrei Shefer, l'chayra, unless you would know with certainty, which would be an impossibility, that this is going to help humans, it would be forbidden to do animal testing l'chayra for medicinal purposes. If you look at the Shvus Yaakov though, in Gimel Ayin Aleph, he disagrees, and you see already in his time, a few hundred years ago, they were doing animal testing with medicines, and a doctor asked them, I want to give a certain potion to a animal to see how the animal processes and metabolizes, and therefore I want to go and see if it's efficacious on the animal. I'll go apply it in humans. And he says, Zichar, there's not going to be a problem in this case because the Ramah is matir and it's going to be mutter. If you look at the Chalkas Yaakov, in Chelik Aleph Lamed, he kind of gives a middle shita. Again, the Imrei Shefer seems to be machmir. The Shvus Yaakov seems to be mekel. And says the Chalkas Yaakov of Breish, of more the modern era Gedolei HaPoskim, he says it is mutter, and there's no Tsar Balei Chayim, so you don't transgress the Isser de Araisa, but he does say maybe it's kedai to avoid it because you're going to have unnecessary pain for the animals. As a Midas Chasidus, there's a lefnimishur sadin to avoid doing this. However, if you look at his contemporary, the Sridei Eish, Rav Yaakov Yechiel Weinberg, in Gimel Zayin, he says, I agree, like the Chalkas Yaakov who's matir, is that it's mutter. Like the Shvus Yaakov, that it's going to be mutter. But he says, that which Rav Breish says, the Chalkas Yaakov says, there's a Midas Chasidus to refrain from engaging in animal testing, Ivit may disagree. Because if you want to be a chassid on your own calculation, if you want to go beyond the letter of the law for your own benefit, and it doesn't affect anybody else, then go ahead. Gesundheit, there's no problem to do that. Says the Sridei Eish, but to go ahead and to go beyond the letter of the law to affect others negatively, that's not an appropriate halachic practice. It's not appropriate to avoid giving animals unnecessary pain at the expense of humans potentially mitigating their pain. And therefore, it says this with the age, not only is it permissible from Tsar Bali Chaim, it's even permissible for Midas Chasidos, and there's no reason to refrain, perhaps it's even a mitzvah, to engage in this testing to make sure that we try to produce medications and healing properties for humans. So it comes out according to many of the Paiskin, the Shvas Yaakov, the Chakas Yaakov, and the Sridei Eish, there's definitely no Isur Tzar Bali Chaim, which is the simple reading of the Ramah, and therefore it would be mutter to do animal testing on medications. The Chakas Shvas Yaakov does just say maybe there's the Chakas Yaakov just says maybe there is L'finim Mishur Sadin of Chasidus to refrain. And we saw the shita of the Imrei Shefer, who's a little bit more machmir, as mashma that maybe there really is potentially an Isra of Tzar Bali Chaim, and therefore it would be prudent to avoid this testing, because you may in fact be transgressing Tzar Bali Chaim. Seems to be the consensus of most Paiskim is that it's going to be mutter, which is really the pashtus of the Ramah. One more nakuda, one more caveat, is the Nishmas Havram. In Even Ezer Hey Yodalid, on this question, and he actually brings a lot of these sources, and most were taken from his work. You can take a look over there where he extensively discusses this question. He says even if it's going to be mutter, which seems to be it is the pashtus, but he says once you're done with the testing, you cannot let these animals suffer unnecessarily, and you must make sure to euthanize them in the most humane way possible. Barer. Even in the testing, you must minimize the pain if it's not going to affect the research and study that you're undertaking. As long as it doesn't affect and impinge upon your testing. If the testing has been completed, if you don't need the animals anymore, and they're suffering, you must euthanize them in the most expeditious and humane way possible. So the maskana is that in halacha from the Gedolei HaPaiskim Al Pi the Mesorah, it is mutter, maybe it's even a mitzvah. There's no Tzar Bali Chaim. Pashtus is not even any Midas Chasidus, and that really reflects on the prevalence of medical testing in animals, which is consistent with the halachic view as well. I hope everybody enjoyed this, and in the Mitzvah in the future, we're going to put out future shiurim for clinical medicine and halacha. Have a wonderful day.